Great, welcome everybody. My name is Thokozile Modonko, and it's great to have you with us this afternoon. My job is really to hold the space and to welcome you all into this discussion today. And we will be going through a few things just in terms of settling. And in the meantime, while I sort out my little tech issue of getting my screen to share, please feel free to put your name and organization in the chat, or you can rename on your Zoom. That way we can see who is in the room today. So welcome to the Public Services Government Employment and Budget Report Launch online webinar. We're really privileged today as the Southern Centre for Inequality Studies Public Economy Project to welcome Pregs Govender and Haroon Bouhat, who will be responding to our colleague Michael Sachs's launch of the report today. The event will be recorded, so please remember to keep your microphones off and do share your questions and ideas in the chat. And just a little bit about the Public Economies project. It aims to build analytical capabilities on macro fiscal policy and public economics to support engagement between government, social partners, and civil societies. And it's located within the Southern Centre for Inequality Studies at the University of Witwatersrand. If you want to learn more about the project, please feel free to note down the link at the bottom, or just look up the Southern Centre for Inequality Studies. So it's always good as we meet in person and we meet online or virtually, to just remember a few webinar principles, or principles when we get together, just in general. The first is really, we would like you all to take a beginner's mindset, even if you are advanced in macro fiscal policy making, or you are new to this area of work. Start from a place of not knowing, and really listen and hear and engage with the content and discussion. We also would like to encourage one conversation at a time. So this is the moment I encourage you to put down your cell phones, your other emails, the other things that are demanding of your time, and really focus on this conversation and enter this space for the next little while. We also like to encourage you to put people at the center of your work. So the people you're designing solutions for or speaking on behalf, to remember to either go back and share what you've learned today with your constituencies or the individuals that you're engaging with, or to try and keep some of the information and data that you have on hand in play that is relevant to them. And then, as always, we encourage and call on you to build on the ideas that you hear today, and to throw those into the chat, or to even request some follow-up sessions. We're here to really branch out and explore as much as possible. So it's always good to sort of situate a little bit as we come into the room as to why we're here today. And I want to say I'm here today, obviously, because of the high levels of inequality in South Africa. But I'm also interested in macroeconomic and fiscal and monetary policy. I'm interested in understanding the budget and understanding the various ways in which we discuss the budget in the mainstream media or amongst ourselves relative to dealing with this issue of the gross inequality that we face in South Africa. And so I'd like you to just take a moment to ask, why are you here? What is of interest to you? You can note it down in the chat if you feel free to share your question or thought, or just note it somewhere as we go forward in the webinar. Just stop the share there. And just by way of introduction, we have Haroon Borhat, who is a professor of economics and director of the Development Policy Research Unit at GCT, and he holds an NRF rating, a very high rating, with numerous publications and articles. And so we're very lucky to have him feedback on this research today. Then we have Preggy Lakshmi. Preg's Govender, a South African human rights activist, feminist, author, and former politician, or maybe she still is, I'm not sure. In an article in the Daily Maverick recently, Preg's has argued that inequality, poverty, violence, and war increases under our economy's law of the jungle, survival of the fittest. And I thought that was an interesting provocation for us as we go into a conversation about the current macroeconomic model that we are engaging with today. So without further ado, we will have Michael present the paper, and we are meeting before the Minister of Finance tables his medium-term budget policy statement. And so our aim is that while you're listening to Michael, that it provides an important context for understanding the speech and the subsequent policy documents that come out with it, at the same time. And so Michael will give about a half an hour input, and then we will have both Haroon and Preg's responding, and then I will chair the Q&A. I will keep track of the chat, and if I see any themes that are coming together, I might directly ask our panelists to speak to them to begin with. So over to you, Michael.
Hey, Toko, and hello to everybody. I see many friends on the line. I hope you can see my screen share now. I just posted the report itself on the chat. So if anyone has not got it, you can hopefully access it on the chat. And I will post the presentation as well once I'm done. So thank you very much. This is a report of the Public Economy Project. I'm going to go straight into it. The report covers quite a lot of budget analysis, and I'm trying to squeeze it into a half an hour presentation. So I won't cover everything in the report, but I hope I give you enough of a taste to perhaps look at it more generally. Let's get this going. So what we're engaged in here is budget analysis. And I know many of the people on the call are budget analysts for government, for civil society and others. And budget analysis has very important uses. The budget itself is unusual in policy making because it forces government to quantify, to state its policy objectives in the form of numbers. And those numbers force government to make clear and explicit trade-offs that we can analyze, whereas most of policy making tends to be in narrative form, in which those trade-offs can be obscured. The choices made, these quantities are tabled in a transparent and process that is subject to democratic oversight. So the report we're presenting today is we're trying to strengthen independent analysis of the budget. Of course, I was once in National Treasury, but I hope now that I can qualify as being independent. We focus on the elements of spending that are under the direct control of policymakers as budget choices. So this means we're focused on the consolidated national budget, which is tabled by cabinet through the Minister of Finance, but then is adopted firstly by Parliament, but very large parts of it are actually adopted by provincial legislatures. So many people kind of don't know this, but when the Minister of Finance tables the consolidated budget in February, a lot of it is estimates of what provinces will do when they appropriate resources, particularly for health and education. And so we are focusing on the elements of spending and resource allocation that are under the direct control of executive authority, under the direct control of Parliament, and which form the basis of budget choices. And what we're hoping to do in this report is lay an analytical foundation that will enable us to update as budgets come up, particularly the February budget. We will be able to update and say, what does this budget change in terms of the picture of spending choices that we're painting here? Of course, the whole report and everything I'm presenting today is based on last year's February budget. And of course, it's a week before the MTBPS. We will see what happens in the MTBPS with some of the propositions here. But unlike the budget, the MTBPS is a policy statement. And so the details of the numbers don't necessarily come out. And of course, you have to wait for the provincial legislatures to table and adopt their own budgets before you get a really detailed picture of what the spending profile looks like into the future. So we've used publicly available data sources. I won't go into them, just to say that a lot of our analysis draws on Persal data that GTAC has placed online, and there's a website linked to that in the document. We've also used the estimates of national expenditure, but more importantly, we've used estimates of provincial revenue and expenditure, which have been consolidated into a data set over the last 10 years and more to give us a picture of how provinces are spending their money. So while budget analysis has these important uses, its strengths are also its weaknesses, because when we say we're doing budget analysis, we are narrowing our focus. And probably the most important narrowing of focus is that we are focused, as I said, the budget forces government to make clear its program in quantities. But when we analyze those quantities, inherently, we will obscure the question of quality. And most would agree that the crisis of public services in South Africa is a crisis of quality. It's a crisis of mismanagement, maladministration, waste, political interference, and the like. We can develop a long list of the qualitative problems with public services. When we analyze a budget, we don't really have a basis to engage too much in that qualitative aspect of things. Measuring productivity, in other words, how much output are you generating from the inputs that you provide in the budget? That's a very complicated question in services generally, but in public services in particular. And we hope to complement what we're doing now with some future research that does look into public sector productivity. But I'm just saying at the outset that there are many qualitative questions of public sector productivity that are critically important, but the framing of the report in terms of budget analysis limits our ability to engage with those questions. Secondly, we are limiting the scope, as I said, to the resource allocation choices that are under the direct control of government as part of the budget process. And that means that other elements of the public sector, which generate their own revenue and which are not subject solely to these decisions of central authority, are not covered in this report. So the most important are state-owned companies and local government, and also the many public entities which receive money from government and so are part of public choices and budget choices, but are financed from transfers. So when we focus on the government wage bill, and of course the government wage bill has been at the center of the fiscal debate over the last 10 years. So when we focus on that government wage bill, we are not dealing with questions of public employment programs, your public works employment and that type of thing. We're not dealing with employment by public entities and public agencies that are financed from transfers, because those budgets are not part of the wage bill of government. We're not looking, so there are many parts of the public sector that are not covered at all by this report. However, the focus on the government wage bill and the focus on the budget choices does account for a very large share of the public sector, and is decisive. And we're focused on the elements which are the subject of choice when we're making fiscal choices. So to begin to go into the content now, fiscal policy aims to cut government consumption. And this graph shows you the gray line is consumer price index. The red lines are two different representations of what is called government consumption. The small dashed line is from the national accounts, and anyone who studied macroeconomics will be familiar with something called G, as in Y equals C plus I plus G. And in the national accounts, government consumption is that G. But I've also showed in the thicker line government consumption, meaning how it's defined in the budget. And the graph is showing you the annual growth of government consumption. And you can see in the 2022 budget, well, first of all, you can see that government consumption has been highly constrained for almost a decade now compared to its previous performance. The difference between the growth of government consumption, which is what you can see here, and the inflation of consumer prices is telling you what is the real growth of government consumption. And you can see that gap has narrowed considerably in the last 10 years. And what is being proposed in the latest budget is a significant contraction of government consumption, far more significant, by the way, than what took place with the last comparable episode of fiscal consolidation, which was GEAR in the 1990s. Now, the question is, what is government consumption? And I have two answers to that question. This is the first answer, and it shows simply the nominal amounts of spending on various functions of government listed along this axis. And the spending is broken into an economic classification. And if you look at the key, essentially what we're saying here is that government consumption is compensation of employees and spending on goods and services. And you can see here then that everything in the green is government consumption. The red is capital spending. So fiscal policy is trying to do two things. First, to lower the overall level of spending, consolidate the fiscus in order to stabilize debt. But secondly, shift the composition of spending away from consumption towards capital. So capital is in the red. The other big element of government spending is transfers, which are in the white. And the point we're making in the report is that if you're going to contract government consumption on two counts, on the first count because you're contracting expenditure overall, but on the second count because you're shifting expenditure from consumption to other things, you are necessarily going to contract spending where government consumption is concentrated. And government consumption is concentrated on these, what we call in the report, core public services, meaning health, basic education, healthcare, and the criminal justice system. These core public services account for 3/4 of government's wage bill. They account for 1/2 of goods and services expenditure by government. And so 2/3 of government consumption financed directly from the budget is health, basic education, and criminal justice. It's important to say that these functions, when we say consumption, usually the argument is that we need to shift from consumption to capital because capital spending promotes growth and consumption spending doesn't. We need to note that education, basic education, criminal justice, and healthcare are also important elements for growth. And indeed, in the 1990s and early 2000s, government made conscious decisions to expand resource allocation to these goods and services in order to address key constraints to growth in the economy, such as crime and a lack of skills. There's a second answer to what is government consumption, or a second aspect of the problem. And that is that, this G that you learn about in macroeconomics is final consumption expenditure by general government. It's a national accounting convention to call it that. But it's important not to get confused. Government does not consume this spending. Government produces the services that are then consumed by households. And there's a wide range of fiscal incident studies, including by Ingrid Woolard and others, but also more recently by our colleague at the Southern Center, Arup Chatterjee and others, which shows that, and also work by Mornay Oosthuizen, I should say, who works with Haroon, that shows that the services produced by government constitute a very large share of the consumption basket of poor households. So when we say we are cutting government consumption, it's important to remember whose consumption we are cutting. It's not the consumption of government, it's the consumption of poor households who consume the services that government produces. Now, there's an inherent problem in what I've just said that I'm sure some of you will pick up on. And this arises from the fact that government services, unlike market services, are decommodified. In other words, they're provided free of charge to any user. We hope that when you call the police, they don't charge you for the service, although that might not actually be the case in practice. So when we value market activities in the national accounts, it's very easy to find the value of education when it is privately provided, because the value is given by the amount that private agents are prepared to pay for that education. But when it is provided free of charge, there is no price with which we can use to value the services. National income accountants overcome this problem by assuming that the value of the services provided by government to households is equal to the cost of the inputs that government procures. So they add up the cost of compensation of employees, the cost of employing the teachers, the nurses, the doctors, and the police officers, and the cost of providing those employees with various complementary inputs, whether it be medicines, school books, or medical equipment, or police cars. That's the value of government consumption. And this is controversial, of course, because simply because government increases the salaries of teachers, does this imply that the consumption basket of poor households has increased in value? And essentially, the stance we take in this report is that no, it does not imply that. That when we increase the value, the real value of spending on textbooks, that would increase the value of the consumption basket of poor households. But when we increase the average pay of teachers, that doesn't necessarily translate into an increase in the value of the goods that are being consumed by poor households. So we use average pay, nominal increases in average pay, as a price increase to deflate the increase in the government compensation of employees' budget in order to calculate what is the real value of this spending, and has it increased or has it decreased for poor households. I will now run through the three main results, I suppose, when we apply, and we use various deflators. You know, one of the problems we're trying to solve here is that government treasury tends to use a single benchmark to evaluate whether it is increasing spending or decreasing spending in real terms, and that's consumer price indices. We, by using average pay to deflate the compensation budget and various other deflators, whether it be medical products inflation or the price of food or the price of petrol for the police and the like, we're trying to get a different measure of what is the real value of government spending, in addition to deflating the spending series, we are also then dividing it by the population of users. And the population of users is different in different contexts. In the education context, it is learners enrolled in the public ordinary school system. In the case of healthcare, it is the uninsured population that depends on public health services. In the case of policing, it is the whole population. So what we find when we deflate government services using these deflators, and we divide it by the number of learners enrolled in the basic education system, we find that real spending per learner on basic education has been declining for a decade. It increased leading up to 2009, but since 2009, it has been falling quite consistently. We are also able then to use the same method and marry it to the budgets that have been tabled in provincial legislatures for, and here we're talking about a sub-program within the provincial spending on basic education, just the public ordinary schools program. And we are asking what is the path of spending over the next 3 years as tabled and adopted in those provincial legislatures. And of course, the path of spending may change. We may see announcements next week that change the path of spending, but what our job is to do is to analyze that path and say, what are the implications for provision of these services? In this scenario, or in this basic education graph, you can see 3 different scenarios. And essentially what we're doing is making 3 different assumptions about how average pay will increase over the next 3 years. The blue line, scenario A, is the assumption that National Treasury makes in the budget, which is essentially that average pay will increase by 1.5% per annum. The red line, scenario B, we assume that average pay in the public service increase, or in basic education services, increases by the inflation forecast contained in the last budget, which is about 4.5%, which is a low inflation forecast now, but is probably aligned with a more realistic idea of how much will average pay increase over the next 3 years. And the green line now assumes that average pay will increase at the more realistic inflation forecast published by the Reserve Bank at its July Monetary Policy Committee statement. So you can see if the budgets remain fixed and are not changed, various changes in the underlying rate of wage inflation would have different consequences for real spending. And we use this framework to look both at the real spending path, but also we ask in the report, which I'm not going to go into now, then how many teachers will departments be able to afford to employ given the budgets they've tabled and given these various assumptions about pay increase. And the picture is not really pretty, because I think the overall message about the last budget is that it made quite unrealistic assumptions. It assumed that pay would increase by 1.5%. My understanding now is that the deal accepted by SADTU and not others is effectively a 4.5% increase, which is in line with scenario B in this graph. So just recap, what is this graph saying? It's saying that in 2009, we spent about 20,000 Rand per learner in the public ordinary school system. And this has fallen towards, let's say, 16,000 Rand already. And depending on the outcome of wage negotiations, if budgets are not adjusted, it is likely to fall further towards 14,000 Rand. Similarly, in the police, we see an increase, a rapid increase, and we have a longer time series for the police because we're using the estimates of national expenditure rather than the provincial expenditure estimates. The police saw a rapid increase in spending on police in the period between 2000 and 2010. And this was, as I mentioned before, a very conscious and deliberate effort to expand policing in the country. but it reached a peak around 2010. And since 2010, real spending on police has been falling and falling from a high of around more than 2,000 Rand to around 1,500 Rand per person in the country in real terms, which is where we are today. I haven't shown you the scenarios here. This estimate going forward assumes, it's essentially the middle scenario from the last graph. It assumes that pay will increase by about 4% or 4.5%. And you can see a continued real decline in real spending on the police. Healthcare has not fared so badly in terms of the headline spending amount over the last 10 years. There has been a decline in healthcare spending in real terms between 2012 and 2018. We've seen in the last few years an increase in health spending and an increase in health employment. And I should say that part of that relates to the response to COVID, but it actually predates the response to COVID, and in my view reflects the absorption of community health workers onto the permanent pay establishment of government in quite large numbers by provinces starting in 2018. So that began the increase in health expenditure, which then obviously there was a lot of additional employment and additional spending associated with COVID. The budget that was tabled in February assumes that the entire increase in spending tabled that was required for COVID is going to be withdrawn, and we're going to end up in a position where real spending per uninsured person on healthcare is going to fall below the level we have seen at least in the last 15 years, and it could be the lowest level ever. Now, government services are inherently labor intensive. The labor intensity of government services is not a South African invention. If you look at police services, healthcare services, and in this example, I'm using education services, the graph is showing you the percent of spending by government on basic education, on secondary education, that is allocated to salaries. And you can see South Africa is about here, we allocate about 80% of our education budget to salaries. There are basic education systems that are much worse than South Africa that allocate less than, well, maybe not worse, I shouldn't say that. There are basic education systems on both sides, better and worse. It's not a question of how much do you allocate to salaries that determines how good your basic education system is. It's the qualitative issues. But when we look at the quantities, we see in this graph that we don't allocate a particularly high percentage of the basic education budget to salaries. And if anything, compared to other countries, we're allocating more to teachers' salaries than to the salaries of others in the basic education sector. So I'm just establishing a general principle that government services are inherently labor intensive, and that then leads us to an analysis of the government wage bill, because in a sense, the resources you have for basic education, policing, criminal justice, and healthcare are the number of people you employ to provide those services. Of course, it's about the number and the quality of people you employ. And as I've been belaboring, we don't necessarily go into the qualitative issues here, but that really determines resource allocation to these services. So over the long term, we see kind of a number of phases in the development of public employment. From 1997 to 2002, here you see the impact of GEAR, the last period of fiscal consolidation. But it's important to note, as we do in the report, that that was also not only a period of fiscal consolidation, but a period of administrative consolidation as the structures of the new state were established. And you saw a significant fall in headcounts. This is just showing you the number of people employed by government and how it's divided between the core public services that we're talking about. Between 2002 and 2012, there was a sustained and significant increase in public employment that was concentrated in the core public services. And since 2012, we've had a stagnation of employment in these public services. This is really taking the same data and just putting it in terms of annual average growth rates. And you can really see now in more fine detail what has happened. Between 2002 and 2007, you had average annual growth rates of headcounts in the public service of somewhere on average of only 1.2%. But for criminal justice, for healthcare, very large increases in employment levels. This continued into 2007 to 2012 with large gains in the level of employment. And as we show in the paper, what it meant was that employment was growing much faster than the population served. However, in the period 2012 to 2019, you've had declines in all of these elements of public services. The total headcounts have been declining. If I'd set the base date or the end date as 2018, healthcare would have also declined. But as I said, going into 2019, you saw an increase in employment in healthcare that has offset that. But the basic point is that I suppose an underlying a lot of what I'm saying is the idea that is commonly advanced, that the reason we are in a fiscal crisis is because we've had unconstrained growth of the government wage bill. And that unconstrained growth of the government wage bill, there are two components to it. The one is headcounts, which I'm showing here. The other is salaries, which I'm going to show you in a minute. And my point is that at least for the last 10 years, we have not had unconstrained growth in government employment. In fact, we've had a decline in the level of public employment that has undermined service provision in these core public services. Also, that the growth that we experienced between 2002 and 2012 was not accidental. It was not runaway growth of back office administrators. It was a very deliberate and conscious choice on the part of government to address deficiencies in our public services, particularly criminal justice, healthcare, and basic education. If you look at government's wage bill today, it is overwhelmingly dominated by the core public services that we define. This pie, and it's just the average share of payments over the PERSAL system for 3 years leading into 2019, you can see that the total pie of the government wage bill is dominated by basic education, healthcare, and criminal justice. Defense accounts for another 6% or so. And then there's a very large share that goes to economic and infrastructure services. This includes public transport, housing, public works, DTI, departments of economic development, and all of those. But if you look at policy, administrative, and executive elements of the public service, they account for less than 3% of the wage bill. This one's a bit complicated, but Michael, also important.
You have 1 minute.
Oh no, Toko, I'm going to rush through this. Okay,
yeah.
So okay, then I'm going to jump over that. The next point is that while headcounts have also not been increasing extensively over the period, the last 10 years, it's also the case that wages have not been increasing. Like they've been increasing, in my view, quite moderately for the last 10 years. You had a very large increase in pay in the public sector between 2002 and 2012 that was associated with the occupation-specific dispensation. That was also a conscious and deliberate choice of government to improve remuneration of public servants. These are real numbers, by the way, in excess of CPI. Over the last 10 years, average pay has been growing at about 2.1% on average, so CPI plus 2.1%. I present data in the report from the quarterly employment survey that shows increases in public pay in the community social services sector of QES. have been at about the same, or if not below, the increases in average pay for private sector counterparts in the QES. I also show from the QES that firstly, the QES data is backing up my picture drawn from Persal, that this is an index, so it shows you growth rates. And if you look at the black line here, it's employment by provincial government, which has been stagnating for a decade leading up to COVID. And national government has also been stagnating and falling for a decade. I think this uptick here is the reallocation of FET colleges to national department, but it's been stagnating. But while this stagnation has taken place, you've seen a very large increase in the private provision of social and community and personal services, essentially private education and private healthcare. So there's a sense that as we contain and constrain government provision of these services, we are creating incentives for people to shift into the private sector to provide those services. Okay, Toko, you're going to have to give me another maybe 5 minutes.
Yep.
Yeah. So a last maybe point that we've made in the paper is that there's been very significant compression of the wage structure in government over the last decade. So this is an index of real average pay by salary level. So at the lowest salary levels, 1 to 3, they've seen their salaries increase by about 30% in real terms. This is after inflation in the last 10 years. The next lowest is, or that's the average of all, I think. If you see salary levels 7 to 9 are here, 4 to 6 are there. The one piece of the public sector wage bill that has been eroded in real terms is senior managers. So senior managers over the last 10 years have seen their pay eroded in real terms. This is showing the same data for occupation-specific dispensations. Again, all the occupation-specific dispensations have seen significant improvements in real pay over the last 10 years. There's one exception, and that is judges and magistrates have seen significant erosion of their real pay in the last 10 years. I'll skip that and go to the conclusions, and I'll paste my presentation just now. So the conclusions are that real spending on core public services has been falling for a decade. Secondly, that if the budget goes ahead as announced in February without any adjustments, we are in for even larger cuts over the next 3 years. It is hard to see how, and certainly the numbers we've looked at suggest that these cuts, whatever pay deal is reached in the negotiations, these are going to be cuts in headcounts. And when we cut the number of police officers, the number of teachers, the number of nurses, we are cutting services. There's no two ways about it. And we spend quite a lot of time in the report showing that there aren't really a large pool of kind of back office staff and others that can be cut. If we're going to cut the size of government employment, we are necessarily going to be cutting frontline service providers. Reducing government consumption means increasing inequality. And that's there are two reasons for that. The first is that you are directly reducing the consumption basket of the poorest. And of course, as people shift into the private sector, it is only those that can afford. So what we will end up with is not a reduction in consumption in South Africa, but a rebalancing of consumption from the public sector to the private sector. And that will have very serious consequences for inequality. We're essentially going to reallocate consumption spending from the poor to the affluent. Also, we show evidence that compensation spending is cannibalizing other budgets, particularly in the healthcare sector and in the policing sector and prisons. And what I mean by this is that budgets for essential complementary inputs are being substantially reduced
to accommodate increases in pay. In the healthcare sector, that's about facilities and maintenance in the main, and you see the results in the burning down of hospitals. In police and prisons, it's about capital expenditure and goods and services. And we try to set out, hopefully, some kind of optimistic way forward by saying that we need to negotiate a new path ahead that places the users of public, that takes into account the concerns of the users. At the moment, the budget is a battle between the Treasury on the one hand, which wants to consolidate the fiscus, the public service unions on the other hand, that want to have more pay and more members for their workers. And my view is that sector departments and the presidency are simply looking on or looking the other way and concentrating not on the crisis of core government services, but are instead simply adding more pressures onto the fiscus through their own new initiatives that they want to place onto the fiscus, which are likely to further erode and crowd out the spending on basic public services. So we need a new path ahead that places these core public services and their users at the center of our fiscal policy discussion. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Michael. And thank you, everyone, for feeding in. Michael, before I hand over to Haroon, just in the background, we had a point around some of the provincial variations to the cuts and the allocations that you've identified. So maybe you want to think a little bit about how do we make sense of this aggregated information at a disaggregated level. And then the second question was, what are your thoughts around the reasons for these trends? And I think this is partly linked to the question of the new path ahead. What is the current path we are using? And how do we name the current path? Is it austerity budgeting, or is it corruption and maladministration? So those are the two that have come through from the chat. So we're now going to have two responses to the presentation, and both for Haroon and Pregs, I'm going to, as I did with Michael, rudely interrupt you when the time is up. He had some leeway because it's basically, you know, the report launch. So I do I have to apologize ahead of time if I rudely shut your time off. So Haroon, if you'd like to share your presentation, and I hand over to you.
Thanks, Toko.
Perfect.
Can you see that? Okay, excellent. So as I said to Michael before we began, he's the lead, the intellectual leader in this room. I'm not a public finance expert, so a lot of what I'm reflecting on is a little bit sort of playing catch up in terms of trying to understand what I think is an incredibly rich input. I mean, there's so much data that we don't have access to. So a little bit of a plug for researchers outside of government, that if the PERSAL data can be made public, I think that's a really important takeaway and a starting point for all of us. So if we could have access to the PERSAL data, I think a lot more interesting work could be done to complement what is already excellent stuff that Michael's done. So let me, I'm actually, so my set of comments are actually more to complement, firstly, what Michael has said, but to some extent also to step back and ask the big questions, and then not to resolve anything in any particular way, and then throw it back to Michael to ask him, as I've said right at the end, what do we do, Michael? Because I think there's a real, if you like, challenge in terms of trade-offs that we face. So first question, which is a really important one. Is the public sector too large in South Africa? And so often we get these debates. Sorry, if I can just move so I can actually see what's on my screen. Is the public sector too large in South Africa? The simple answer and the short answer is no. The long answer, you can see it in the data on the left. So this is some data that we've produced at the DPRU. We've just taken a mixture of mainly middle-income countries and looked at public sector employment as a share of total employment. You see South Africa is below the average, right? So we can dispense with the idea that we've got too many people. And I think Michael, in different ways, has gotten into that and show data to reflect that. So let me just. So I think that at least gives us a data point with respect to size of the public sector and gives us a cross-country sense of numbers of individuals. And in terms of at least the labor market literature that I know much better, this is not an unimportant issue, right? The extent to which you've got very large public sector labor markets in developing countries. So we don't have that. What about the public sector wage bill? Right, so that's, remember, and I'm going to come back to this, there are two components in a discussion around the wage bill. There's headcount or employment, and then there's the actual wage, right? And the multiplication of the two gives you the wage bill. So you may have low employment, but it's possible that the few employees or the fewer employees you have are paid at above average levels. And it turns out that we do have a public sector wage bill, not massively so, but that is certainly above the average for the similar or same sample of countries as per the previous data. So the long answer is you've got public sector compensation that is above the average for a developing country or a sample of developing countries or middle income countries. So we do have a macro issue, and I think it was one of the comments in the box as well around the interest burden and so on. So the extent to which you think about macro balances and the role that the public sector wage bill plays in that is important. The nuance, which I think is the point that Michael made, is that it's possibly less about headcount and more about wages, but I'll come back to that. So has the public sector wage bill become unsustainable? So again, two sets of data that may be useful. Michael didn't quite deal with this, so I'd be interested in his views. The figure on the left, again, all this is sort of DPRU research, shows you the evolution of public sector compensation as a share of GDP from 93 as it comes down. I think Michael called it the gear years, and then starts spiking, I think, post the Zuma presidency. So there's a question there about the evolution of the public sector wage bill over time and what are the drivers. Again, I think somebody actually asked that question in the chat box. So there's a really interesting way to think about, let's call it wastage or relative expenditure. So if you look at the wage bill to GDP relative to the wage bill to national expenditure, if you think of this as public service provisioning, then you should be on the 45-degree line. So in other words, relative to output, national output, your wage bill, right, relative to output compared to your wage bill relative to national expenditure should be at the same level. In other words, you should be somewhere here. That's generally a sort of neutral public wage bill, if you like. South Africa's up here. So relative to GDP, right, wage bill relative to GDP, we look at wage bill relative public expenditure, it's much higher. That ratio is much, much higher. And never mind in absolute terms, the value is much, much higher. So we look like Brazil, Cyprus, Romania, and so on. So for me, that's always a trigger for concern around the relative level of the wage bill. So I wanted to just, and excuse the equation, but that's just a really important way to think about components of the public sector wage bill. So just to be very clear, when a wage bill shifts, there are two ways in which the wage bill, two drivers in terms of the wage bill shifting. One is the change in employment, and the other is the change in wages. And what you need to do is figure out which is the driver, right? And the mechanical mathematics of it is that the change in the wage bill is the sum of the change in the mean wage over that period, right? But you weight it by average employment. And then the second component is the opposite, the change in employment weighted by the average wage. That's just the mathematical mechanics of it, and it's a sheer decomposition. If you do that, and I think Michael and team have done that, he didn't mention it, but you will find that it's wages and not employment that's driving the overall wage bill. So the figure on the right is much simpler. If you look at the blue and the gray line, what's very clear is that it's not really been employment, right? Although it's not linear over the period, but certainly it tends to be wages that are driving the overall wage bill. Okay, so a really important deduction is, again, Michael said it's not headcount, so it's not the number of teachers and so on. I would just extend that and say the driver of the overall rise in the wage bill that we saw, right, given that previous graphic, so the driver of this guy here, right, has not been growing employees, expanding employment, but actually expanding a wage bill, which is the gray line. So that at least gives us the diagnosis of where to focus on, which is rising wages. And I think that's where a lot of the public sector wage negotiations are going, right? I just want to put a little footnote for all the labor economists or the micro people. I see some researchers on the call. If you go into QLFS and you do the analysis, you'll get the opposite result. Purcell's far more accurate, so just be aware you'll actually get the opposite, but I think incorrect result from the QLFS, because of course Purcell is administrative data. That being said, I do want to go back to how we think about, and I've got one more slide after this, how we think about public versus private sector premium. Why this is really important is because if you think of Michael's point at the end about the shift to private provisioning of education, of health, and so on, right? The question is, are public sector workers being paid more relative to similar workers in the private sector? And if that's the case, is that a concern? And that's often referred to as the public sector wage premium, right? So again, the econometrics model that this is based on is a propensity score matching model, which is drawn from the literature, avoids, again, for the econometricians, we avoid the instrumental variable problems, right? So it's a technique that's pretty cool. So you get the public and the private sector wage employees to look similar, and you then estimate the conditional difference. So it turns out that the difference is not massive, right? But on average, public sector workers would earn about 1,000 Rand or make it 972 Rands more than private sector workers. That's equivalent to about 12,000 Rand per year. By developing country standards, not massive, right? But just keep in mind, therefore, that there are premium that operate to workers in the public sector that need to be considered when you think about public-private sector provisioning. So this is what I've concluded with, which is to plead from Michael, given the incredibly rich data he's provided us with, to help us think through my last comment, what do we do, Michael? Because you are at a logjam, right? You've got returns to spending, or the productivity of that spending that's declined, which Michael has outlined very, very well. And that comes through in terms of the declining quality of schooling, deterioration in public health services. You can look at the data, right? So if you look at returns to schooling, if you look at test scores, those have declined, right, over time, or they are certainly much lower relative to other countries where they have similar levels of spending on education, for example. And you can pick different indicators, whether it's health and crime prevention, to look at the returns to spending that are much lower relative to other countries. So if employment is not the issue, right, and you go through the public, that's Michael's point, you go through this public sector wage discussion, you've effectively reduced wages, right, let's assume. Services then decline even further as productivity falls. And then you've got this cycle that you've entered, which is the flight to the private sector and so on. I have a question for Michael, which is, to what extent is there this unintended, so I just want to be clear about that, unintended crowding out of government consumption expenditure because of the increased demands on social assistance? Is that something that you've looked at? So if one looks at alternatives, can we think about complementary capital spending? So right at the beginning, you had a graph where you spoke about consumption and capital spending. Perhaps there's complementary capital spending, right, to increase the productivity of public sector workers. So what do I mean by that? Let's take the simple home affairs example. One of the things that could improve efficiency without changing the wage bill is increased capital spending on IT provisioning within Home Affairs, right? So the processing of visas and so on and ID documents. That seems like an ideal capital expenditure with a massive return without significantly affecting the wage bill. Do you think that's possible in terms of getting us out of this sort of logjam or the cycle we're in? And then finally, is there a possibility of productivity agreements, right? So to some extent, you could then, what you give on the wage bill, you could take or offer or get back for the final consumer, the final citizen in the country in terms of productivity agreements, and whether that's a possibility. Okay, let me stop there. I think I've saved you some time, Chair.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Shireen. That was excellent. And just as you are sitting back and listening to Pregs, and this is also again for Michael, there's been a real rush on the chat, which is excellent. And again, I apologize if we don't get to all the comments and points. We are going to keep them and hopefully design further research or further webinars. But I think one of the things that is being raised by both Michael and Haroon so far is that there is a need for interdisciplinary approaches to budget analysis. So there's been an interaction and discussion on the chat so far between fiscal policy and rules and the impact in the real world or in the real economy. And so we have questions about what does this mean in the private sector? What does it mean for efficiency, productivity? And again, depending on your political leaning and your ideological bent, you're going to come to those questions from different angles. An important question is around the social services that I think we should come to around social care services being included in the analysis. So that's just something for you to note, Michael, when I come back to you after we hear from Pregs. So Pregs, over to you.
Thanks very much, Togo, and thanks, Michael, for that presentation, and Haroon for yours as well. As I was listening to you, I was trying to understand also, I think it's really important the way in which you've disaggregated what is happening in terms of these cuts around health, education, and policing and correctional services. And I suppose I wanted for you to flesh out a bit more about, because you spoke about poor households. And I'd like you to disaggregate who exactly is carrying the burden in those poor households, and what's the disaggregated impact. So I think that I suppose I'd like you to talk about the unpaid care economy and its relationship to what you've spoken about, and whether. And I suppose in relation to that, whether the connections between what you're talking about and the reality that we have not as a country been able to shift the apartheid patriarchal capitalist special geography of South Africa remains deeply entrenched. So the statistics you're quoting also goes up in each of those areas. So access, so you've talked about the private sector provision of education, and I think it's the question then of who has access to private sector when the public sector fails. And you've raised the question of efficiencies, corruptions, etc. And I think those are really important questions to look at. But I think there's a question that comes before that, and that question, I suppose, is really about what is our priority? So in 94, moving into a democratic South Africa, 96, a constitution which talks about dignity, equality, freedom, releasing the potential of each person, talks about socioeconomic rights being the substance of dignity, equality, and freedom. And what kind of, and in that same year, in 96, when the Constitution was adopted, in that same year, we also adopted GEAR. And I suppose the question of what is the kind of macroeconomic policy framework that was required to be able to realize the rights in our Constitution. So the Universal Declaration on Human Rights talks about the fact that you need an international and social order capable of realizing human rights. And what is that order? What is that economic system that has failed to realize those rights in our country? And how do we begin to shift that? So for example, you know, you've talked about this being for policy analysts, and I suppose the question for me is also, what kind of training do economists have? Who do they see? Who do they not see? Who's visible, who's invisible, whose work counts, whose work doesn't count? And I suppose that's why I'm asking about the question of the impacts and the implications of this for the unpaid care economy. Who's carrying that burden? And I suppose the question of the cuts and the way in which the trade-offs take place. So you've talked about in your paper, you know, we'd all like to, and I quote, we'd all like to see better schools, hospitals, police stations, but expanding the number and quality of these facilities while also hugely cutting back operating costs is not only irrational, but borders on populism. And I completely agree with you. And I suppose the other question is the projections, targets, and forward estimates contained in government's most recent fiscal plan for the 2022 budget imply a direct trade-off between the value provided by government services on the one hand and transfers to grants and employment programs. Why are we making those trade-offs? Why is government making trade-offs? Essentially, that will impact badly on people, worst on people who are poor, and prevent the realization of constitutional rights. Why are those the trade-offs? And I suppose that's the constant question of what is those trade-offs. So in one of your slides, and I didn't catch it quick enough, Michael, but and maybe you'd put it up again. There was the question of how much we're paying on debt, on the servicing of debt. And I suppose I'd like you to disaggregate that a little bit as well. And what is our response to that? How do we deal with that? What are the options and the alternatives in relation to that? And I suppose I want to raise the question of who does the budget subsidize and who is being subsidized. And I suppose when we're talking about budget, budgets are really about, it's a statement of macroeconomic policy choices. So it's not just about income and expenditure and the detail of that, it is about that, but it's also about what's our choices that we're making, who are we valuing? And I suppose in relation to that, I'd like to look at some of just an anecdotal example, and I suppose there's many things that you could deal with more effectively than myself, and Harun can as well. But if you think about, and it's an example I used yesterday in the workshop that had taken place of the Budget Justice Coalition, was the example from the Western Cape during the drought. And it's not specifically to do with education, healthcare, and policing, but I think it's about how do you see also the indivisibility of human rights, the interconnection, the interdependence, and the fact that everything has a knock-on effect, both in the short term and in the long term. So who you're prioritizing, what you're prioritizing, who's bearing the costs, hasn't just got short-term impact, it's got long-term impact. So the specific example I wanted to give was during the drought, the figures that came out were that informal settlements were utilizing less than 3% of the water. And a study, I think it was a PAIR application that one of the, I'm not sure whether it was an NGO or that had done it, had applied for it, to try to get an understanding of the 10 largest users of water during the drought. And the 10 largest users of water during the drought included major international corporations like Coca-Cola's subsidiary in South Africa, I think like Chevron subsidiary in South Africa, but I think you'd have to check that. But I suppose the question of how could they be the 10 biggest users of water, and people in informal settlements having access to less than 3% of the water, yet government's image of water wastage was a dripping tap in a poor community. So the question of, and I think that you raised right at the outset of your paper, is by analyzing publicly available evidence, the report hopes to contribute to public discourse on fiscal adjustments and their social impact. And I suppose for me, the question is that public discourse is skewed by those who have the resources to influence what information is presented, how that information is presented, who is stereotyped, and in what context, and how are we limiting our possibilities for really transforming our country. And the seemingly impossibilities, and they're not, they are possible to shift it. And I suppose I want to end with the question of power, and whose power and whose interests drive the choices that are being made. So you do raise a question, I think you put a proposal forward. You talk about an alternative strategy would be to commit to funding permanent increases in spending on both social consumption and transfers, and explicitly financing these commitments with higher taxation. That's a very specific proposal, and I think it would be really interesting to explore that more to hear more about that from yourself. And I think I want to end with something that has been very concerning around gender responsive budgeting. And that was something that was started in South Africa in 1994. It was initiated in 1994 through the national budget debates in Parliament, and subsequently with civil society, to actually research every single government department's budget and look at the policy impact, whether the policies are there and what's the implications, the impact of those policies, and whether people's lives are changing, and it hasn't really. So the thing I want to raise, because I think it does relate to the overall question of, it comes back to the question of what's the order, the economic order, the social order that that Universal Declaration talks about to realize the rights in the Constitution. And we by looking at the detail is incredibly important, but I think to actually look at, to take a step back, which you and Harun are in a very good position to do, is to say, well, what would shift this entrenched inequality? And what are we doing that's replicating the things that have actually caused the problem? So the thing I want to end with is I think it was last year, the IMF assisted Treasury to develop the gender responsive budget framework for government. And this year, in July this year, they released a gender strategy. The IMF released its gender strategy, which has been really challenged by feminists and their organizations and movements. And there's a recent letter that's going to be sent, I think, to the IMF this week. But the key, I think one of the key demands really of that is for the IMF to look at, to assess its own mechanisms, its own governance, and its own policies, and what is the human rights and gendered impact of their framework. And is it consistent with economic, gender, environmental, and distributive justice? And I suppose, I think I'd leave it there, Togo, but I look forward to listening to Michael and to Harun. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Prix. And if I can just ask everybody, I'm really pleased to see that we've kept the numbers online. We had over 100 people on, and we appreciate your stamina. And we've had some excellent questions come through the chat. And I can tell you now, we're not going to get to all of them. But what we will do is promise to either follow up with another webinar or a shorter paper or piece. But we really encourage you all to take this paper and make of it what you need to make of it. So right at the beginning, I just wanted to encourage you. Michael was saying budget analysis. We often wanted to do everything and anything and be a cure-all. But it really is, I like to think myself, a tool amongst a bunch of tools, to use a cliche, overused analogy, that can really help us to make sense of the kind of myth busting, which is a very strong theme in the chat, that this paper has really been able to debunk and deal with some myths. It's raised some important questions around how we assess the nature and scope of our public service. Do we use GDP? Do we use population? So there's been an interesting debate and discussion around that. And then there's been, again, the overall arching question, which I think both Prix and Haroon have challenged you, Michael, on, is, so if it's the economy, stupid, what kind of economy can deliver the public service and public services that we need? And that's kind of a theme that's coming through the chat, is what are we actually talking about? Because when we start comparing with the private sector, we really want to have a conversation about the economy and what the role is for the public service and the provision of public goods within that. So Michael, I'm going to hand over to you for a quick response, and then if we can open up to all three, Prix, Haroon, and Michael, and then I'll take some questions. And as soon as Michael has given his response to the input, and I think he has been looking at the chat, I will open up for questions, and we will close at 2 o'clock. Michael, over to you.
Perhaps I should not be surprised that many of the questions in the chat and many of the issues that are being raised are more about the macroeconomic framework, the fiscal policy framework, rather than the content of the report we published today, where we're saying so we've discussed and I've discussed those issues quite extensively. But I think where it kind of meets both Haroon and Prig's comments, and also a lot of the comments in the chat, is essentially, I suppose, what I'm arguing is that you know, in the popular narrative, there is, and in government, there is a widely held view that we are in a fiscal crisis because of public servants demanding too high salaries, and because of a bloated state that is unproductive. And what we're trying to say in this paper is that, firstly, that if there is a wage premium, which I'm sure there is of the public sector, and if public servants are paid too much, it is not because over the last 10 years there have been unrealistic increases in salaries. It's because government took conscious decisions in the 2000s under the leadership of Thabo Mbeki and Trevor Manuel to significantly increase the number of frontline workers and provide more extensive services, and to increase the pay of those workers. And of course, when those decisions were implemented, particularly the decision to implement occupation-specific dispensation, the political leadership, as is again the case now, was preoccupied with their own internal battles in the period 2007 to 2010. And so paid no attention to these issues. But nevertheless, what happened was a substantial increase in pay
that was not at all linked to productivity. And that's kind of the history of a decade ago. But when that took place, we didn't have any fiscal crisis. We didn't have a fiscal crisis at that point as a result of those decisions. Subsequently, the increases in pay have been moderate. And particularly if you benchmark them against the private sector, I mean, if you look at the top of the distribution, senior executives and managers, you've seen a boom in income at the top of the income distribution, which has been documented by Ingrid Woolard and others. Meanwhile, managers in the public service have seen their real pay eroded. Public sector workers have been awarded moderate pay increases. So the question is, if we are now embarking on a strategy to force down the pay of teachers and police officers and nurses, we should not think, I mean, my argument is not that that should not be done as such. My argument is that that will have consequences. And in particular, it will have consequences for the provision of public services on which the poor depend. Because if we go back to the reason why public sector wages were raised in the first place by the occupation-specific dispensation, it was because you had a brain drain from the public sector of nurses and doctors. And in the current environment, we seem to be embarking on a path that redistributes consumption from the public sector to the private sector. And I'm not sure I think it's important to highlight that and ask if that's what we want to do. Some people, I mean, I think I'm not going to kind of maybe go into, I'll take Haroon and Craig's mainly as contributions that we will continue to discuss. But I think we should be very cautious with international comparisons. You know, we live in a society that has a particular and peculiar structure and an extremely high level of inequality. And then when we say, if we're saying that we employ the public, and we have also, let's not forget, 40% unemployment. So when we look at international comparisons and we see that public sector workers constitute a larger share of the labor market, well, shouldn't that be the case in a society with 40% unemployment? I don't know. So the question we need to ask is not so much where are we on the regression line? Are we at the mean, or are we above or below of international comparison? The question we need to ask is, what are the developments currently taking place, and what are they going to be the implications for political and social development in South Africa, as well as economic development? I suppose the other big issue about rising salaries as a share of GDP is that, for me, and other people have been talking about this in the chat, and I agree, that I suppose the argument I'm making is, it's not that salaries have been increasing too fast, it's that GDP has been increasing too slowly. And inevitably, if GDP per capita has been stagnating since 2012, and that is why we are in a fiscal crisis, not because we have an extensive state that delivers social services extensively and employs people in order to deliver those services. So if, maybe going to some of the questions that Pregs was raising, if this GDP per capita continues to decline, the likely outcome is a worsening of inequality as the kind of pressures and forces I'm documenting in the reports take hold. And I think that is what is taking place. And the consequence will be a retrogression in social and economic rights. And to me, the question is not so, I think that is unavoidable in a context of an economy that is stagnating and declining. The question is government concerned about that? And quite frankly, I do not think it is. I think government is concerned with public employment programs, and this is what I mean by adding significant new pressures into the budget. Government is concerned with a further extension of social grants. Government is concerned with doing things that are going to be popular for the electorate, like showing that they're able to generate these public employment jobs for some people and extending social grants. But they are tabling budgets that imply a real reduction, a retrogression in the provision of healthcare, basic education, and criminal justice. And they're offering no explanation as to why they are doing this. And they don't seem to be factoring it into a planning in any kind of way. It seems to be not their concern, but simply the outcome of policy incoherence. So I think there's a big trade-off that is taking place, and I didn't, mention social grants and the like, but in a sense, what we're saying in this report is like, it's all very well to extend social grants, but if you're going to do that at the expense of these core services, we need to ask whether that's the right strategy. Many people would say it is the right strategy, including Milton Friedman, who initially proposed exactly that strategy, that we should replace government services with cash handouts. So I think I will stop there just to create time for others. And there's a lot in the chat that I wasn't looking at because I was trying to listen to Haroon and Pregs, and we will have more conversations about these issues going forward. Thank you very much for everyone on the chat. Neil Colvin, just try and reduce the volume on the chat post, my friend. It's very helpful, but the space is limited. Thank you very much.
We have a counter paper in preparation, so that's where the chat will go. So what we will do now, I did post in the chat that I really would like to ask you to think of your one burning question, and the question can be for either Michael, Pregs, Haroon, all three, or just a broader question that you are throwing out. In sort of thinking through and looking at the chat and the time that we have left, we recognize the impact and dynamic that local government has, and the way in which we would need to look specifically at local government for further analysis. So we're not going to address it today, unfortunately, in the detail that perhaps you might have liked. But this isn't something that's not on the radar for when these budgets get tabled and the way we make sense of them. Because just to reassure you that my beginning working on this was from a local level, recognizing that the impact that I was seeing on the ground had manifestations in the macroeconomic and fiscal framework itself. So each of these things are reinforcing and have dynamics. So what I'd like to do is, if you could just use the hand function, you go to, depending on what kind of, if you're on your laptop or on your phone, you're looking for reactions and then raise hand. I'll call out the names. I apologize for any mispronunciations now ahead of time. And then you will be unmuted. And then if you can please just mute yourself as soon as possible. So please feel free to put your hands up and I will be tracking them. And I see the first hand is Russell Rensburg. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Listen, I hold no horses in this race. I think our concern is, thank you, Michael, for a very interesting and what definitional clarity on some of the issues that we're dealing with in public finance and rights realization. But I think what worries me, though, is that we're also cognizant of a broader social fiscal squeeze, right? And the outlook doesn't look great for the next 2 to 3 years. We believe the World Bank, the IMF, the OECD, and even our own local analysts. Given the state's obligation to at least maintain and progressively realize socioeconomic rights, has the time come for us to be a little bit more explicit about who within the uninsured populations we prioritize? Right? I use the example of healthcare. You rightly say that healthcare spending has largely kept abreast or has been protected. But the distribution of that spending isn't always as equitable. We spend a large percentage of the money on hospitals, up to district hospital level. So sometimes that confuses what we spend on primary healthcare. But our health outcomes on a primary level and our headcount or participation at a primary care level, clinics and community health centers is where the majority of the population access healthcare services. Are we ready to have a difficult conversation about prioritizing spending where the need is the greatest? Thank you, over.
Thanks, Russell. And then we have Dick Forsland.
Oh, yes, thank you. Yeah, thank you for this excellent report. It's very useful, I think. I would like to ask Michael about taxation. And so, I mean, we had what we have called at AIDC, a tax cut revolution from 2000 and 2008, the same period as the large social grants system was introduced. And I think that is one reason why judges or whatever accepted wage increases on or below inflation or whatever would happen. And as for the compression in the public sector, so that is point one. What about taxation, an increase in the tax rate? And I mean that there you have the whole problem of the moral high ground lacking for the government, but still the issue must be raised to the public. Second, when it comes to sort of wage compression in public sector, isn't that also effect of the, well, if you look at other research at UCT, you will see that so-called unskilled and semi-skilled workers they have had stagnating real wages for a long time period now, but those who are increasing in wages, these are the ones so-called skilled workers. And you have a very high education level in the public sector on the average. I think the difference is the union strength in the public sector. So the group 1 to 6 or whatever it might sort of compare to unskilled or low skilled labor, they have not suffered this declining real wages as in the private sector, which I believe should never have taken place, but it has to do with union strength and so on. So that is 2 questions.
I don't see any other further hands, so we'll take those 2 questions for now.
So on Russell's question about healthcare financing, there's a little bit of evidence that we look at in the report around healthcare financing. And the conclusion that we reach is really as follows. One of the reasons why healthcare financing has not been reduced in real terms to such an extent as criminal justice and basic education is that provincial governments are allocating a larger and larger proportion of the healthcare system is financed from the equitable share. And the reason for that is that national government has been shifting its funding into primary services and HIV and AIDS and community services. Now, none of this is wrong. It's just to say that as national government has shifted money towards the primary level, which is kind of the objective of policy, what we've been doing is starving the hospital system. And hospitals, particularly provincial, specialized, and district hospitals, have been having a lower and lower resource allocation. So and this is over the last decade. So when you see things happening like Life Esidimeni, that's about specialized hospitals. Funding for primary healthcare has been prioritized by national. Provinces have been forced by the force of spending demands in central hospitals. And remember, those central hospitals are concentrated in a few provinces to raise spending on healthcare. So now in Gauteng, healthcare is the biggest spending item above education. Western Cape already had much bigger share of spending on healthcare than other provinces, and it just sustained this high share.
So provinces have been forced to shift their spending. The problem with shifting money to primary healthcare, and maybe it goes to Haroon's point about catalytic investments in capital, is that it's all very well to shift the money to primary healthcare, but if the patients don't follow, if the patients continue to use provincial and tertiary facilities for their primary healthcare needs, then overall you're going to erode the value of services that the average patient receives who is going to a hospital. So again, I would recommend looking at that section on healthcare. We do quite a lot of analysis of how the healthcare budget is structured and how these pressures have had a differential impact on different levels of care. In terms of taxation, I mean, we don't deal with taxation at all in this paper, but my view is that taxation is going to have to rise. Even if you proceed with the current fiscal consolidation, we are in a classic position where if, and it goes to the questions of debt service costs, if your interest rate, meaning the interest rate on government bonds, is higher than your rate of growth, and you are unable to close the deficit, you are in a position where you will have to continuously raise taxes or continuously reduce spending, or a combination of the two. So the emphasis of government has very much been on reducing spending, and arguments have been made that, you know, that's what we have to do. Unfortunately, that has an impact on the distribution of income, which is negative. At some point, given the existing spending needs and the new spending needs that are now being placed on the table, taxes will have to rise. Taxes simply will have to rise to deal with the hangover of the huge debt that we face now. So the question about taxation is not whether taxes should rise, it's which taxes should rise and what spending priorities those new taxes are going to finance. In terms of the wage compression, I mean, we make an argument in the paper that I alluded to briefly in the presentation, saying that at there are two elements in the public sector wage bill that have seen their real salary, their real average pay decline over the last decade. That is senior managers and judges and magistrates. In the case of judges and magistrates, people in the sector may well pose the question that, is this constitutional? Because the Constitution says that the salaries of judges may not be reduced. The Constitution doesn't engage in deflating their salaries with price indices. But one has to ask, if you, and I mean, maybe it's a good example of what I'm talking about more generally. If you're going to force down the salaries of judges and magistrates, but you're doing so in a society with a very large legal services sector that is paid internationally dollar-based salaries, what do you expect to happen to the quality of the judges and magistrates that you are able to recruit and sustain? Economics will tell you that there's going to be a consequence for changing these incentives. Similarly, for public sector managers who live in a society where private executives are paid salaries that are on par with their international colleagues in dollar terms, but you force down the pay of public sector managers, will this not have an impact on the capability of the state? And I think it will, and it has. And it is a large part of the explanation of why there's been a brain drain from the public sector over the last 10 years. I think I've answered all the questions.
Cool. Thanks so much, Michael. So I'm going to take liberties as the chair, and I'm going to ask Michael and Haroon and Pregs. And for those of you that have stuck it out, you can answer this on the chat. So I'm going to be a little bit let's end off with a bit of soothsaying. If you were the minister, what would be in your top 3 announcements in your mini budget next week? I'll repeat it. If you were the minister, what would, and any minister, so let's not label the minister that we currently have, what would be in your top 3 announcements in your mini budget, and why? Sorry, I didn't say and why. So I think let's start with Prigs.
I'm going to ask you to go to the other 2 so I can think more about that.
Okay. Haroon, are you ready to rock and roll?
Not being ready has never stopped me before, so let's go for it.
Great.
So it's interesting because I had some comments back to Michael, but I can take it offline. I disagree with the deflator argument about GDP. So because it actually reflects adjustments, but we can talk about how you manage public finances in an adjustment sense, right? So that's why even declining GDP matters, right? But let's park that for now. And it'll come back to answering your question, Toko, is that I asked myself, so what are we trying to solve for? And it seems to me that at least the one thing across the chat we can all agree on is we're trying to solve for, let's say, improved outcomes in public services, whether that's better teaching quality, improved matric pass rates, declining infant mortality, right? So you want improved outcomes. So that's what you're trying to solve for. And what are your options on the public services or the public sector side? It's either more people or higher wages, right? And for reasons that we may or may not like, those are incredibly difficult to achieve at the moment. But the other is improving or changing productivity outcomes. The 4th would be capital spending. And the 5th one we have not emphasized enough is to reduce wastage, which is a nice way of saying to be completely tough on corruption, right? And so in many ways, for me, the last 3 would be the 3 announcements from the Minister of Finance, right? The one is to lock in productivity agreements. I think if you can get very clear productivity agreements with teachers, with nurses, with police officers through the bargaining council, Michael mentioned that. He said it's all about wages. What about productivity outcomes? So that's the first. The second is capital spending. I cannot emphasize enough how important that is. And I'll give one example from an area I know really well. Is one of the key reasons we've seen in labor law cases, one of the key reasons we've seen inefficiency in those outcomes. So, for example, you'll find that a court finds in favor of a mine worker on a dispute, and they need to give the mine worker the money, but it's taken 6 years for them to resolve the dispute, and they can't find the mine worker. That problem is an IT problem. Judges sit with physical court records in their offices. There's no IT spending to upgrade IT infrastructure in the Department of Justice. Capital spending is about that. It's not just about bridges and roads. So capital spending in form of IT infrastructure to increase efficiency. It may involve also lots of IT infrastructure to improve police officers and police stations productivity. And there are details on that. And the third is if there's a way to institute very clear, effective, and this is sort of a magic wand statement, to reduce wastage and corruption at the public sector level without fear or favor. And I think for me, those are the 3 things that actually could improve public service outcomes without fixing or without dealing with any of the employment and wage issues. Thanks.
Thanks, Arun. Michael?
So I would say, first of all, I disagree entirely with what Haroon is saying about capital spending, because I think there is, Marx talks about a fetishism of commodities. And I think in South Africa, we have a fetishism of capital spending. Whereas in fact, most of our capital spending is actually consumption. Just it's consumption that involves bricks and mortar and IT systems in particular, I should say. So if you look at the health system over the last 20 years, we want to fight corruption, but we want to spend more on IT. Might be a contradiction because it is frequently through poorly planned and executed IT systems that we face these huge problems. And if you look at the experience of the National Treasury with the integrated financial management system, it's a case in point. So the question of shifting from consumption to investment is an important question, but it is not primarily a budget question. If we want to improve the public sector's IT infrastructure, the first thing we should do is talk about that institution called SETA, which all government departments have to procure their IT infrastructure from. So I'm not against investment in new IT systems. I'm saying this is not primarily a question of budget allocation. And by repeating the mantra of capital spending, what we are doing, what the budget has been doing, is again placing this double burden of austerity on the core public services, which are inherently about consumption spending, healthcare, education, and criminal justice. And so I think I would not announce a further shift towards capital spending. I would rather announce a shift towards concern with core public sectors. The other reason I think why we have this fetishism of capital spending, quite frankly, is that at the political level, capital spending is contracts. And so you find even provinces and provincial political leadership that is supposed to deliver healthcare and basic education are not really concerned to a large extent, as far as I can see, with the deterioration in those services, because their main concern is to increase capital spending. So I think we need to unearth this capital. What would be my 3 announcements? I don't know, Toko. I think, you know, that a decisive resolution of the Eskom debt is probably the single most important thing. I must say, we must remember what the medium-term budget policy statement is. It is not a budget. It is a statement. So the minister, it would be great, and we've set out in the paper what we see the elements of a new path being. The elements of a new path would be marrying the concern with public sector pay to a concern with public sector productivity. It is not possible for the Minister of Finance to impose these things on sector and government in general. In fact, that's the problem, is that for the last 10 years, ministers of finance have been imposing fiscal constraint on a government that is unwilling to make fiscal consolidation a central feature of its program. And as a consequence, you get all of these perverse outcomes. So we really need to think about not, you know, the ANC and the president love to talk about the social compact, but the social compact they think about is a kind of abstract meeting at the apex of labor and capital that will kind of resolve all of South Africa's underlying problems. What we need is a public sector compact that takes account of the needs and expectations of public sector workers, the needs or the pressure towards fiscal consolidation, and the needs and expectations of the users of public services, that puts on the agenda a public sector reform agenda that can save the public sector in this very difficult situation. So those would be the kind of things that
Right.
I would announce.
Thank you. I so want to jump in, but I'm not going to. Pregs, it's your turn.
Thanks, Togo. I suppose the first question I'd like to have, the first issue I would like to see is how we utilize so the windfall taxes that were announced. How could those be utilized to provide the to address the maximum available resources that are required to realize human rights? So we don't have to make these choices, these trade-offs constantly between, which are all going to impact worst on people who are poor. So, the question that people are forced to then look at, and Russell has raised this issue of the choice between hospitals and primary healthcare facilities, and you actually need both. And you should not be cutting on one or the other. It's a sort of short-term thinking that informed in the first term of parliament and government, the cutting of teacher training colleges were cut, mental health care budgets were cut. Of course, you're going to, what we have today is the result of those kinds of short-term thinking. You've got to think in the long term, and you've got to think about the impact and the knock-on effects of every choice we're making. So I think that I would really look at how do we use our resources better? How do we actually, and I'm not discounting all the important questions that were raised in relation to capacity, effectiveness, efficiency, etc. Part of that is that you actually need to spend to create the capacity. So teacher training colleges, if you cut them, you're not going to have teachers capable of teaching maths who aren't trained in maths, which is one of the questions in the chat. Or there's going to be a whole range of inefficiencies that will result as a result of that short-term thinking. So you've got to think long-term, and you've got to think in integrated fashion, and you've got to think across local, provincial, and national. There's no time to be thinking in these silos. So I think the question of how do you train the policymakers, and how do the policymakers understand and are accountable, and how do you have real sort of public participation in the budget processes is quite a critical question, because if you think that you're going to be sitting really disconnected from what is actually happening and what those percentages in terms of the stats mean and how they actually work out in reality. So the stats of 40% unemployment goes to about 90% in poor areas and more. And how do people actually survive? And I think I want to say to Michael, you've ducked the question of the unpaid care economy, and you've got to address the question because the issue of who's carrying the burden when these cuts happen, who carries the burden, and to what is the, so when women are taken care of because of gendered roles, relationships, and unequal power in poor communities, they of the cuts to healthcare or education, who's carrying the cost? Who's actually making sure that they're taken care of? And what's the cost to their health, their time, etc.? And what's the cost to our country as a whole? So we're not being able to apply the analysis. And I would say to Michael, it is time to integrate a feminist analysis into your economics, because I think the question of why is it that the areas that are being cut, if you apply a feminist lens to that, you're going to ask those questions about who's actually being affected by those cuts, and why is it that those particular sectors face the worst conditions. What does it say about how we as a society, who we value, and whose work and time and energy, etc., we actually easily can replace or pull in and pull out? Who are the cheap workers, the cheap labor force that's there? We've got to disaggregate that. We've got to change the thing from past patterns. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much. So we have done very well with time, and I can see Michael is itching, so I'm not going to even let him speak because we do need to close. And thank you all for participating on the chat and for the input. I can tell you, as a new member of the Southern Centre on Inequality Studies, that we will definitely be bringing a feminist lens to the work. and we already are, and we will increase this. So we have heard that call loudly, and look forward to sharing more of our analysis on the points that have been raised in the chat from that perspective. So Haroon and Pregs, thank you very much for your input and response, and for being such generous respondents today. And I'd like to thank the background team. There's been a team sitting behind me helping to make sure that everything runs smoothly today, and I want to thank you all for making that happen. And then again, to the 71 of you that have stayed on till 1:58. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Please take the conversations to your spaces. Anything that is burning that comes up over the next couple of days, or when you listen to the speech next week, please let us know, and please reference us when you write your responses, so that we can see that there has been a connection in ideas, thoughts, and thinking. Even if it's a vehement disagreement, we're all going to learn if we come with a beginner's mind. So a big thank you to you, brilliant webinar group. And I wish you a lovely Wednesday, and see you all next week as we comment on the mini budget and the medium-term budget policy statement. So thank you very much.